It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for those who woke up early this morning. Hopefully, some of what I'll talk about today will be interesting to you. Today, I wanted to talk about some of the work so all the work I'll be talking about will be work in my academic group at Stanford, where we've been thinking a lot about what it means to measure aspects of AI systems and how we can do this, how we can build a good practice around building better scientific practice into AI measurement. So for those of you who are not aware, let me give a little bit of some context in how measurement works in the AI ecosystem. Okay, so AI, arguably practice of benchmarking and sort of measurement in AI, a lot of the history is attributed to work by Bill Hilgerman, who started at the time looking at optical character recognition. So these are trying to figure out written characters and predict what digits it would be. The work here would be, you go from these little dots that are meant to represent different either letters or numbers, and then you have some system that can tell from the dots what number you're trying to predict. And over time, I think this practice has really gotten deep into the AI ecosystem. Beyond AI, I think all around computing, all around many areas of science, this idea of building shared data sets that lots of people look at and everyone works on as a way to improve the practice of whatever science we're trying to build. In fact, I think regularly now we talk about benchmarking being a superpower of the AI community. So there's a very nice write-up on this by Dave Patterson, who talks about benchmarking being potentially or can be thought of as an AI superpower. So as this has been developing within the field, I think a lot of the work early on was thinking through to what extent could we trust some of what we're learning from building and developing benchmarks. A lot of the early work focused on questions around statistical validity. So these are questions around, if I build some kind of model and the data changes in various ways, do I expect the models to behave similarly when the data has shifted? And so there's been, I think, quite interesting recent work that's shown, I think, interesting, surprising results about how stable the rankings of models can be to various kinds of data perturbations. I think some interesting examples include work in 2019 where Recht and others looked at ImageNet and played with sort of various ways of perturbing the data, looked at model rankings to see whether models that were considered better or worse remained better or worse when the data changed a fair amount. There's also very interesting work by a former student of mine, Wale, who looked at changing ImageNet completely. So actually completely change the data set, seeing how stable the results were. The main takeaway of those set of slides, I think, is this fascinating observation that despite the fact that classic statistics says that if I look at my data multiple times, everything should break because you should get results that are unstable when I reuse data sets, as we do in building benchmarks. In practice, in fact, we're seeing quite stable results. And I think we don't yet have the right statistical tools to understand why benchmarks have been so stable for telling us which models are better and worse. Now, over time, benchmarks have changed. Some of the older work, again, things like ImageNet, things like other kinds of big benchmarks that are built in this way, have shifted to the kinds of benchmarks that we build for things like large language models and other kinds of models in more modern practice. So an example of a benchmark that you might see in 2025 is GPQA benchmark. So this is the graduate level Google Proof Q&A benchmark. So if you haven't seen this, this is a benchmark that was built to try to evaluate a language model, a large language model. They spent a lot of time talking to experts in physics, chemistry, biology, and they built this data set very carefully curated to capture how well language models could answer sort of roughly graduate level questions in these topics. And I think some of what was special here was they were checking to what extent could lay people do well. So if I just gave people in this room, or maybe myself, because I don't know that much, I've forgotten almost everything I learned about physics and chemistry. from when I was a student. But non-experts get up to something like 34% accuracy on solving this task at the time it was released. Experts who know the field still find this challenging, so they're in the 65 to 74% accuracy. And at the time, GPT-4 was only at 34% accuracy. And so one might ask, what kinds of claims can you make based on an observation of model performance on this data set? So suppose I build some new language model. I evaluate it on this GPQA benchmark, and I see 97% accuracy on the benchmark. So one claim you could make is that the model can do a good job answering graduate level questions in biology, chemistry, and physics. Another stronger inference you could make is one that's been made by maybe some of the companies who are using this benchmark as part of product marketing and sort of other ways that we're thinking about AI progress. I'm showing a result from Anthropic here, but plug in any of the large model players. They've made claims that look like this. And so a second claim that you could make, please, is that the model has achieved graduate level reasoning. And so part of what I'm hoping to talk about at the beginning of this talk today is those two claims and how to evaluate how reasonable those claims might be given the evidence of performance on the GPQA benchmark. What I would claim is that claim 1 is more reasonable as a claim than claim 2. Or to say it more formally, claim 1, which is that the model can answer these graduate level questions, is much more supported by the evidence of this benchmark result than claim 2, the model has achieved some kind of graduate level reasoning. I'd like to dig a little bit into these kinds of directions today. Okay, so over time, again, I think this question of what to do about benchmarks has, I think, really exploded in the ecosystem. When benchmarks became a big part of practice, they really were designed for the community to evaluate itself. So it's really for us to understand what our models are doing, how things were improving, what has gotten better, and this kind of shared practice across many people who are all over the world doing many different things. I think some of what has changed is now that benchmarks have moved from internal research science to really impactful, high-stakes societal decision-making. But the practice that we've built around how to think about benchmarks has not evolved at the same time as the impact that they're having in the world. So some examples of, in my view, what mostly the field has focused on, I think very important questions, but my focus would be to shift and expand beyond these questions. Include questions around things like data and content validity. So is data correct? Are there mistakes in the kinds of benchmarks that we're building? Again, very important question, one that you need to engage with. Another interesting one is, models get better at this very quick rate. And in fact, you set out a benchmark, within months, some model has gotten very high performance on this benchmark. And so there's a lot of effort on just working through how to build benchmarks that are harder and harder for models to do well on. I'd like to argue that, in fact, I think the problems are much more challenging because of the impact the benchmarks are having. And in fact, I'd like to argue that in many ways, we're in a measurement crisis in a similar way that many other fields in science have had to engage with this question of the impact of measurements and the impact of benchmarks. So some examples to ground this include this work all across the world in AI regulation. Many of you might be aware or involved. Many of the regulators are looking at benchmarks as ways to measure and decide whether AI is ready for deployment in various kinds of societally impactful applications. In particular, the EOA Act uses benchmarks to help determine things like high risk of models. There's lots of high stakes deployment decisions. People are deciding about whether to deploy models in healthcare contexts and other kinds of high stake decision-making contexts based on results that come from benchmarks. As many of you know, there have been huge amounts of resource investments in the AI system, AI world broadly. A lot of it has been guided and motivated by the results of how models score on various kinds of tests, things like benchmarks. And I'd argue that a lot of public sentiment and trust has been shaped by what the community has told the world about what AI models can do, the stories that we're telling, which have gone beyond again, very specific stories about what measurements are telling us, to broader stories about abilities of these models in high-stakes settings and high-stakes deployments. And the goal, hopefully, what I'd like to talk about today is maybe how to engage a little bit more in understanding and hopefully improving how we think about and how we deploy measurement practices to help better inform these kinds of decisions that have a high impact in the world. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about 3 papers that cover various aspects of this question. First, I'll talk about some work that I've been doing trying to better frame this validity question and how to evaluate and think about claims that we're making when we build benchmarks. Next, I'll talk a bit about some of the models that we're building to help us better implement measurement practice and evaluating models. And then finally, I'll talk about some work we're doing around predicting model interventions and impacts of various kinds of model perturbations, which I think is tied again, in some ways specific to AI, but I think tied broadly to how we understand what measurements is meant to do. And I'll end up with some open questions that I hope some of you will find interesting and may engage on. Okay, so the first one is, I think, a proposal, but one that I think is important, is that measurements should be focused on the validity of specific claims that are being made. And to argue this, some of what we've seen is that when one is engaging in sort of broadly societally impactful deployments, so questions around policy, governance, high impact decision making, measurements play such a big role in bridging how we think about the technology and its broader impact. In particular, I'd like to argue for thinking about validity as a way to give a language to talk about questions around framing what we want when we build a measurement process and critically engaging with what we get when we get the results from this measurement practice. Okay, so I'll mostly talk about a paper that is on archive now, is in the process of going through the publication process, with a group of incredible collaborators, students, postdocs, called From Measurement to Meaning, a validity-centered approach to AI evaluation. I'll only spend a couple of minutes just giving a high level of key ideas from this paper. Okay, so to be a bit more specific, an evaluation, so say a benchmark, an audit, or a qualitative report, I think the main ask of this first part is that an evaluation should support a very specific claim. So a claim like some kind of judgment, some kind of decision. So in thinking about this, some of the steps include thinking through what the object of a claim is, what it is that we're trying to measure, what the claim we're actually willing to make based on this subject, and then what evidence we have to support the claim that we're trying to make. So again, for any of you that have studied sort of philosophy of science, very classic science framing, this is just very classic ways of thinking about what it means to run experiments and understand the world from data. And I think the question here is we should apply this same kind of rigor to what we're doing when we build AI measurements and AI practice. So there are various ways that you could try to implement this. An example of a claim would be, is a model good at performing arithmetic? So arithmetic accuracy. Another kind of claim that's much bigger is, is some model intelligence. And then an example of how you might want to, what you might want to say about the claim might be, for the arithmetic example, you could ask, wait, can the model be used as a calculator? The intelligence one is, is the model intelligent? And because of this, can I then infer some properties about what this model might do in the world? And examples of the kind of evidence to support the arithmetic claim might be, high scores on very standardized tests or other kinds of simple arithmetic kinds of measurements. An example of an intelligence evidence could be, theoretically, something like ability to solve, a hard math problem. And you might try to argue that this means the model has high intelligence. So there are 2 kinds of evaluations that one can try to make. So one is what are called criterions. These are directly observable aspects of properties of the measurements that we can see directly from data. So for instance, evaluating arithmetic accuracy, whether a model can solve math problems, is something that you can measure very easily just based on prediction accuracy, just asking the model various kinds of arithmetic questions. So it's a sort of very narrow, very well-defined kind of claim. So these are called criterions. A more complicated question might be the intelligence question. So this is complicated because you can't actually observe intelligence directly. You have to infer it from other things that you see. And so these are called constructs. These are unobservable. You need various kinds of measurement instruments to try to support this kind of claim that you're trying to make. Things like reasoning, intelligence, more modern things like safety, all these often fall into this kind of bucket. To examine this, we can look at, again, the GPQA example from a few slides ago. So the two scenarios, one is, the model, the object is this multiple choice questions in graduate level chemistry, physics, and biology, and how accurate the model is. This would be a criterion. Construct might be, so the claim that you're willing to make in this setting is that models can accurately answer these kinds of questions. A second scenario is, the model is able to reason, which is often a statement that, again, many in the community would like to make. And you might then be wanting to make the claim, AI models can reason, as the kind of argument that you're making. So in order to engage with this, in the paper, we talk through 5 things that we should think through in order to be able to try to make claims about some object of some measurement process. And the key question here is, how well does your evaluation, whatever it is that you've built to evaluate your model, your process, how well does it measure what you're intending to measure? And I'll go through some examples of these 2 claims. So the simple claim of the model could answer graduate level Q&A questions. And then this claim 2, this bigger claim of the model has reached graduate level reasoning. With the differences being, the first one is simpler, much more directly observable. So it's a criterion. The second one is harder, much harder to observe and define, is this sort of trickier construct. So the first question that we ask is, does the evaluation cover all the relevant cases that you care about? So this is called content validity. So we think this claim is well supported by the GPQA work because there's a lot of work in building expert curated questions. People have shown already, the work has shown already, there's a difference between experts and non-experts on this benchmark. And so this claim of models being able to have high content validity for GPQA is well supported. However, as you know, multiple choice is very different from what actually happens when you're actually doing the practice of reasoning in real science questions. A real scientist is not asked multiple choice questions to understand whether or not they understand science. And so we think that this content validity argument is weak for GPQA, for instance, for being able to argue that the model can reason, just based purely on only using multiple choice question answering. The next question we ask is criterion validity. So does the evaluation correlate with some known standard? Can I look up some other existing evaluation process that's well trusted to help argue that what I'm doing is valid? And so for claim 1, again, we think is well supported. So about just graduate level question answering, because again, lots of work has gone into human expert validation. And so we know that there's some strong connection. But again, there are no other reasoning benchmarks that are well trusted to be able to make this stronger argument that the model has reached graduate level reasoning. So we think the construct criteria, the criterion validity is broken here. A third one is construct validity. So I think this is probably the key question, which asks, does the evaluation measure the intended underlying construct? And the argument here is, there are many ways that there's a gap between what we actually measured in GPQA and what we hope to say about model reasoning. So in particular, we can't separate whether the model has just memorized the data sets versus whether it actually is reasoning through the claims that we're making. We already talked about the multiple choice. So whether or not multiple choice, being able to answer multiple choice actually tells us anything deeper about how well models are able to solve tasks. So by the way, the claim here is not that the models can't do these things or don't have these properties. The claim here is that looking at results on a GPQA benchmark doesn't give you enough evidence to make the claim that the model has graduate level reasoning. So you need much more sophisticated arguments than what is currently being made to make that kind of claim. So the next is external validity. Does the evaluation generalize across different environments? This is a version of things like distribution shifts. Will this thing break completely when I deploy it into the world compared to my little silo of the evaluation process? So again, this is easy in the first setting. The evaluation mirrors what is typically done in practice. We think is well supported. We think this is much weaker for the claim 2 about gradual level reasoning because it only looks at 3 topics. So it looks at, again, biology, physics, chemistry, a couple of scientific topics, much smaller than all of gradual level reasoning. And so we think this claim is not well supported for this bigger argument. And then finally, consequential validity. So this is asking, what is the impact of this claim that you're making? Does the evaluation consider the real world impacts and the interpretation of the test? And so again, here we think, well, somewhat supported for claim 1, though we found that people are very quick to overgeneralize the arguments that are made from many benchmarks. And we think that this is definitely broken for claim 2. Human-like reasoning is, again, a strong inference and maybe too strong to make simply by looking at GPQA results. Okay, so I only spent a couple of minutes on this. There's a much longer paper that you can find in the archive, and I encourage you to take a look at it. But the key idea in this first part of the talk is to help engage with how we can better make clear claims about the evidence that we can get from our evaluation practice, asking questions about whether the evaluation actually covers the relevant cases, whether or not it correlates with known standards that allow us to make this argument, what the evaluation measures and whether or not it actually measures the thing that we intend to measure, whether it generalizes across different contexts, environments, and settings, and then whether, okay, so I think I copied, pasted the last 2. But last one also, to what extent does it, what are the sort of downstream impacts or implications of the points or the evaluation practice that we've made? And so our argument here is that these are important parts of building a good evaluation practice within the field. The more that AI evaluations are used to make big decisions in the world, the better we should be about scientific grounding for trying to make claims about evaluation inference. Okay, so next I'll shift gears a little bit and talk about some work on trying to build probabilistic models to help us better interrogate the results of benchmarks and other AI measurement practice. So the key ideas here is that we can learn from lots of work that has built sort of existing tools for measurement science. And specifically here, I'll focus on latent variable models that we can use to sort of disambiguate various aspects of measurement, capture associations, help us operationalize some of this practice of building sort of some of the constructs that I argued about in the beginning. And some of the tools that we'll be using are tools that look like things like factor models, latent variable models, item response theory models that come from things like education. Okay, so I'll mostly be talking about work from some students and colleagues that was recently presented at ICML a few months ago, called Reliable and Efficient Amortized Model-Based Evaluation. Okay, so suppose one is trying to evaluate a model on a benchmark. The way, again, we would typically do this in modern practice. So a lot of these examples are taken from Stanford Helm. Helm is a sort of a database and sort of software toolkit that's been built for trying to evaluate language models, other kinds of AI models, modern large-scale foundation models. And so one of the typical ways that you might do this, say like the GPQA example, but many other kinds of benchmarks, is that you ask some question, you look at the response, and you measure whether the model got the answer right. So that the model correctly responds to a particular question. And so in order to evaluate performance, you might just average the number of correct responses. So this is how many questions on average did the model get correct. So this is, again, standard practice. You might see small variations of this. If you look at Helm, for instance, what they do is they look at average win rates. They look at models against each other. It's pairwise competition, and they rank models by how often they win against other models. But underlying the idea is the same, which is, again, measuring roughly how often model gets answers correct on some sets of benchmarks as a way to get a handle on or build some measurement sort of infrastructure. If you look at the measurement science literature, for instance, psychometrics literature, this approach is called classical test theory. So this has been, it's not surprising, this is, again, standard way to think about correctness evaluation. there's some things that we found that are challenging from this idea, which motivated us to come up with some new approaches to this question. So one of them is that you need to be able to see all the same questions across all the models that you're evaluating. Otherwise, this approach breaks. So if I have one data set and I evaluate 10 models on it, and I have a second data set and I evaluate another 10 models on it, I can't compare the numbers across those two data sets. Because if the questions don't overlap, then the inference from how close the models might be on set of data sets A and data sets B are completely uncomparable. So this shows up in a lot of different settings. This shows up when you're doing, for instance, things like audits, when you're doing red teaming, where you're asking very different questions to different sets of models, where it's hard to compare the results across models because the questions don't overlap exactly. Another thing that shows up, which we found surprising, but actually has had a high impact, is that it actually starts to get really expensive to do really good evaluation at scale. So what I mean by this is, outside of a couple of companies who spend incredible amount of budget on, say, building large foundation models, for most people who are building AI tools, if you're going to do a good job, evaluation actually ends up being a large fraction of the budget to build and deploy an AI model. So in fact, both the set of models that you need to evaluate, the sort of inference and compute costs to run all the models, the sort of practice around the sort of compute, data, like all of that infrastructure, the software tools for evaluation, have slowly crept up in how expensive they are, to the point where for most organizations, and including most academic groups, the evaluation component of building and sort of developing some new AI tool is actually a meaningful fraction of the budget of building and deploying, or like the whole practice is actually, the evaluation part is actually a big fraction of the budget of what you're building. And so let's go back to, say, what you might do in a standard AI evaluation. So something like Helm. So in Helm, I'm showing here on the vertical axis a variety of different models. So the standard ones, things like Claude and ChatGPT models, and then some of the smaller open source models, some of the larger ones as well. And then on the other axis, I'm showing questions across different benchmarks. So different benchmarks and then the questions within them. And so this you can think of as a matrix or a tensor, where one dimension is the sets of models, the other dimension is the set of items. And so the questions you're interested in is evaluating how well models do on this observed data sets. How well they do if I create or add new models. So I want to be able to understand not just some existing models, but how to rank, say, new models that I'm going to evaluate later. And also how well models might do on new data sets that I haven't evaluated them on yet. So some of the questions we're hoping to answer are understanding what's happening within evaluated data sets, and then how to generalize for new models and new data sets as well. So in this paper, we build a very simple, basic probabilistic generative model. If any of you have seen sort of basic probabilistic models, this is one of the simpler ones. The goal is to try to understand how to evaluate the correctness of a model on a particular example. So model I on example J. And what we do here that's maybe different from the standard practice is that we build a model to try to explain this observation. So here we have two parameters. One parameter we call the model capability, theta. The second parameter we call the example or item difficulty. So how hard is this item? And the model here is the likelihood that the model answers the question correctly is a function of how far away the model capability is from the item difficulty. So if the item is very difficult, but the model is very capable, the gap is very close, and so the model will answer the question correctly. If the question is very hard, but the model is not capable, then the model is likely to get the question wrong, and vice versa. If the question is very easy, the model is very capable, then the model will get the question right. So that's the very basic underlying model. In the measurement theory literature, this is called the RASH model. This is often the sort of basic measurement model for folks who are dealing with things like education. Okay. So some of what I forgot to mention is that that's the basic model. You can do some other more interesting things. You can add, for instance, cheating. You can add memorization. There are other ways to make that model much more expansive. We just built the simplest version of the model for this initial experiment. We looked at 22 data sets from the Helm database. is about 200,000 questions over 172 large language models. And we simply look at correct or incorrect, though you can do more complicated things as well, beyond just the yes, no, correct or incorrect. Okay, so the first result to show here is how well the probabilistic model does compared to simply asking the basic sort of average performance. And the main point of showing this is just to show that, on the simple case, the modeling approach matches well with the standard practice of simply asking sort of average number of questions that a model gets correct. So we look at a goodness of fit measure, here the Breyer score. We also look at the AUROC of this prediction. And the key takeaway here is that the model capabilities strongly correlate with sort of classic ways of measuring how good models are. We're also able to do some things that you can't do with standard sort of average performance in a data set. So we're able to evaluate settings where the test examples don't overlap. I have some set of examples from some set of benchmarks and another set of examples from a different set of benchmarks. And I want to evaluate a set of models on these two non-overlapping data sets. And if you look at what you might get by just looking at average performance, what we show here is that you can get some essentially chance performance. So you can't tell apart which models are better or worse if my questions don't overlap exactly. However, using the model that I just talked about, we're able to get a much stronger performance, very close to if we had actually seen the same set of examples on all the different questions. So our AUC here is a proxy measure for how good the performance is compared to if I had actually seen the ground truth of the model performance. And we show here that even when the questions don't overlap, we can get very high performance if I'm able to build models underlying the sort of observations of correctness of across each of these benchmarks. So here, showing some of the useful properties of a modeling approach to building evaluations. Okay, next we also look at whether we can reduce the cost of evaluations using active learning under this model. So here we build a simple active learning strategy. I won't go into much of the details, but the rough idea is that at each iteration, we pick the next question to evaluate a model based on its currently estimated capability. And so if a model is considered to be capable, you get to ask harder questions. If a model is less capable, you're asking easier questions, with the goal of trying to get a better handle on how capable the model is, as opposed to just asking all the questions for all the models, which is where the expense comes from. What we show here, the rough takeaway, is that we can get high accuracy evaluations of model capability, but using much fewer questions, much fewer items than you would have to do in the classic case. So we show examples where you can reduce the overhead by up to 82% while still getting high performance on predicting or evaluating model capability. So this means that you can use 82% less data in your data set while still getting a sort of good proxy for the performance of a particular model. Okay, the other thing we do is we come up with new tools for trying to predict question difficulty. I'll go high level here, but we built some additional infrastructure with an embedding model that's able to predict how difficult a new question that you bring into your database might be. This is interesting and important because the classic way of solving this problem needs you to recalibrate the whole, recalibrate everything every time new questions come in. We show that you can do this much more cheaply without having to do everything from scratch. Okay, and again, we show this using some sort of fairly standard infrastructure. We use some text embeddings from Llama for the Helm data set, and we're able to show that we can get very good performance by predicting model sort of difficulty as opposed to, again, trying to model it and restart the evaluation every time with new items. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting that we do is we see to what extent can I create new questions. So given that I've built a model, can I actually synthesize a question for a target difficulty? So this allows you to sort of adaptively create new questions to get at particular capabilities or particular properties of the model. And so what we do here, we have the sort of first version of this idea. We use some of the standard approaches from like RLHF kinds of approaches. So based on trying to synthesize new questions targeting a particular capability. And we're able to show that you can do this effectively for the Helm data set. So some examples of the kinds of questions. So these are completely new synthesized questions from a model that we've designed to target a particular difficulty. And we show some examples from AirBench is a data set that's created for safety and trying to look at risks of models. We show some examples, again, targeting difficulty. And we also show some examples for things like MMLU, which is a capability data set, capturing how well models can answer various kinds of things like scientific questions. So the key idea here is that we can synthesize new questions targeting particular difficulty estimates. Okay, so I've only given out a rough summary. There's many more details in the paper. There's code that you can download and run. This stuff on Hugging Face. We have part of repo on Helm as well. And the key ideas in this section is that we can improve reliability and interpretability of evaluation processes using probabilistic models. Here, we did a very basic version of this probabilistic models that was able to disentangle capability of models from question difficulty. And then we showed that it gives a bunch of useful properties. We don't need exact overlap across benchmarks. We can combine it with active learning to significantly reduce overhead for scaling up how many questions we can evaluate, so how efficiently we can evaluate benchmarks. And then we have some interesting contributions of being able to synthesize new questions, predicting difficulty of new questions, things like that. So I'm really excited about the potential of probabilistic models within evaluation practice itself. This is different from probabilistic models for solving some applied problem. This is a probabilistic model to engage with evaluation. And I think there's a lot of potential in building better tools for these kinds of questions. Okay, finally, I'll spend a couple of minutes on a problem that I think, it shows up in many areas, but I think the AI version of this has been quite fascinating, which is trying to predict intervention effects of various kinds of scaling that we do in AI models. So these might be questions around what happens if I increase data, what happens if I increase compute, model iterations, what might I expect in terms of model performance. So usually we do this via various kinds of post-analysis. You run experiments across a variety of different models, and then you try to evaluate the models after you're done. If you've heard about things like scaling laws come from this kind of idea. We've done some work in this direction. I'm going to talk a little bit about some other line of work thinking about what is called model collapse that also engages with this. But the rough idea in this area is not just understanding a benchmark that you're building now, but you're trying to understand what might happen to model behavior if I intervene on various aspects of the model. So again, things like data, compute, number of iterations, what happens with test time scaling, all these kinds of questions. So model collapse is an interesting one because it's asking this question of what happens to AI models if I train on their outputs over and over again. So the idea is I have some data sets, I train some model, I synthesize from this model, so there's a generative model, I can create examples, and then I train AI models on the results of my synthesis. And I do this over and over again, and I want to see what happens over lots of iterations. So, there's some early work in the field that has tried to ask this question. There's been lots of media attention on the results of some of this early work. I'm showing work from Forbes, New York Times, many other places that have engaged with this idea of model collapse threatening to kill AI progress in generative AI. This may or may not be true, but I want to take some of what we've covered in the first section to critically engage with this question of model collapse. So with some colleagues, we did this work on trying to understand the existing practice of model collapse. There's a position paper that you can take a look at on arXiv. And roughly the idea here is, again, training on synthetic data leads to these degenerative feedback loops. And so future models will all break because, as many of you might know, a large fraction of the web is already synthetic data, and we only think this trend is going to continue. When we looked at the literature, what we find is that there are many different definitions of what people mean by model collapse. In fact, we found 8 definitions with various kinds of conditions. And in fact, generally, the definitions were incompatible across the different models. In our view, we think that this is actually an example of a validity failure in engaging with this practice of what we should expect, predicting interventions of training models on their own outputs. Okay, so to engage with some of the early discussion, On the content validity side, what we showed is that a lot of the existing studies assume that every time you train the models, you only use the synthetic data while trying to make predictions about what's going to happen on the web. Where in fact, what happens is you get a combination of synthetic data and real data. And what we show in a variety of different papers is that this combination actually changes the behavior of the sort of iterative model training by a lot. So the version where everything is synthetic data versus the version where you're mixing synthetic and real data actually has very different properties. Second, we look at the construct validity, and here we think the issue here is people actually haven't defined what they want, what they mean by model collapse. So it has a colloquial meaning. It has a meaning that sort of people think like they understand, but actually if you look at the science, there are many different definitions. We show here roughly 3 buckets of definitions, but actually the science doesn't agree on what we actually mean. And when people write papers, they're not always clear or specific about what they actually are studying. On external validity, what we find is that the results are actually kind of fragile. If you go beyond small-scale experiments in the experimental setup, much of the results break in various kinds of ways. And in consequential validity, we think this is worrying because most of the story has been around, again, the sort of main mode of models will collapse and will end up predicting gibberish. We think the bigger question is that when you train models over and over again, they tend to forget minority subpopulations and tail behavior. And in fact, so it's a different kind of failure mode, which we think is much more important, which is models will essentially more and more forget sort of small subcomponents or small subpopulations and will overload on the majority view, which will not show up as easily in error behavior or the standard things that people are studying in model collapse. So we think this is a very distinctively different kind of failure mode. It's still important, we think, but very different than the main story in the media around model collapse. Okay, so I've shown this example of model collapse, but broadly this idea of trying to predict long-term effects of various kinds of interventions on models, I think is a very important direction. I think validity can be very helpful for trying to strengthen and clarify what kinds of claims we're trying to make and make them stronger. Beyond collapse, we do a bunch of related work around various kinds of scaling laws for things like resource allocation, governance, various kinds of decision making as models are getting bigger. Okay, so I want to cover some open questions on things that I think should have a lot more effort and work on. I'm hoping some of you might find interesting to engage with. So first of all, there's this meaningful disconnect between the people who are trying to understand the capabilities of models and people who are trying to understand the real world impact of models. And mostly these people the two communities don't seem to talk to each other. They seem to actually be completely separate, distinct communities. We think this is a mistake because, again, models are being deployed in the real world and having real world impacts, but this conversation is not happening between the upstream capabilities and the downstream impacts. So what I'd like to see and what we hope we can encourage is much more work trying to close the loop between understanding upstream aspects of capabilities of models and, again, what it might mean in terms of real world practice. So upstream, thinking about maybe benchmarks, but also other kinds of tools, third-party audits, red teaming, engaging with the stakeholders, like people in this room, scientists, developers, trying to build better benchmarks, trying to build better audits, where, again, the challenges are some of the challenges that the field is engaging with, things like cheating, saturation, compute costs, but also connecting this to what this means in the real world. So asking questions around how various capabilities might actually map to impacts in various applications, what it might mean in scientific applications, healthcare applications, in terms of long-run effects in society. So stakeholders around developers, civil society, policymakers, other kinds of third-party evaluators. And asking questions around using tools like user studies, policy, understanding policy incentives, stakeholder incentives, to better engage with what the impacts might be downstream of models deployed in the world. So again, I think there's a lot to be said and a lot of work that can be done in trying to close this loop between the upstream and the downstream in evaluation practice. Another open question, this is much more narrow technology, but I think an important one, is asking questions around how we're building most of our benchmarks for AI, particularly language models. So most benchmarks are built on multiple choice question answering because it's easy to scale. You ask the model a question, you ask which answer is correct, A, B, C, D, you pick the right one. This scales well, but actually there's a lot of work showing that this is as I've argued, but also as you might know, it's very far from what people actually do and what people actually want to use these models for. So it doesn't give us a good proxy for real-world behavior. It also doesn't give us a good proxy for underlying capabilities, because if we're trying to measure some aspect of problem solving or what it might do in a healthcare context, multiple choice is not a good way to evaluate what might actually happen. So there's been work. I think a lot of the effort right now is trying to do various kinds of AI as a judge. There are many, many issues with AI as a judge approaches, I think some of which we're hoping to help solve. I found some good intuition from work around mechanism design. So there's a recent paper from my group, but there's many other kinds of work trying to engage with. Are there new approaches that we can use to evaluate models that don't depend as strongly on multiple choice question answering? It might give us a better, much more valid approaches to evaluating models at scale. Next, third open question is a lot of what I've talked about today and a lot of the existing conceptualization of what it means to measure models are very strongly shaped by what we think is happening with humans. So, we don't actually know how close models should be to human behavior. We assume a lot, and I'd like to argue that these assumptions can cause lots of issues. So we know that the kinds of mistakes models make and the kinds of mistakes humans make are very different. It's actually not obvious that the kinds of exams that we built for people are good exams for AI models. In fact, I find this position paper recently, and not from my group, but I think from related groups, very interesting. They say, completely, we just should not be evaluating AI models using human tests. And we should be developing tests that are specific for language models and other kinds of AI models. And I think it makes some really good arguments. I encourage you to take a look at the paper. There are also lots of other issues that we should be careful around. Psychometrics and the sort of strong anchoring of measurement has led to some issues in education. We need to be careful about not replicating those kinds of issues and society from our AI practice. So I think there's some things that we can do better in how we connect, how we think about AI measurement and existing practice in human measurement. And then finally, I think we just need to do a much better job scaling institutions and giving avenues for engaging in what it means to measure and understand AI evaluation, both in terms of what targets and how to critique the results of evaluation process. So, what capabilities should we care about? What actually matters to measure? What kinds of risks matter? What kinds of capabilities matter? What social context are we thinking about for the measurement practice? Whose perspective should inform the design? How does measurement shape the ecosystem and power dynamics across the different players? Who should fund evaluation research? Who has access to this kind of infrastructure? I think these are important questions. We started to do some work in these directions with some colleagues in a recent paper, but I think there's a lot more to be done there, both in terms of thinking, but also in terms of deployments around the institutional aspects of scaling up evaluation practice. Okay, so some of what I hope to see as some paths forward. So for researchers, I think we just need to be much more careful about what we're measuring when we build benchmarks. We've become too lazy in making very big claims about aspects of measurements that are not valid and not supported by what we're actually measuring. So we should be careful about stating what benchmarks measure and don't measure. We should report validity evidence, so specific evidence about what claims we're making and how that's tied to what the measurement practice has shown, and better theory that helps us connect measurements to the capabilities. For industry, I'd like to see more investment in infrastructure beyond things like leaderboards, more work in grounding capability claims in appropriate evidence, and better recognition of limitations of the evaluation and benchmarking practice. For policymakers, I think much more effort in demanding that when a researcher or a company is telling you a story about what an AI model can do, they're actually backing up that story with real evidence and sort of real data that matches the capability claims that are being made. Much more diversity in the ways that we think about evaluation, just beyond purely around benchmarks, and funding processes that allow for independent evaluation research. And I'd also like to see much more civil society engagement in what it is we should measure, what are the downstream aspects or applications that matter, helping us critique unsupported claims of capability or safety and other existing approaches in AI measurement practice. Okay, so I'll end here. I've talked through a few different ideas around what I hope is the beginning of starting to build a measurement science infrastructure. I've talked through some ideas of some of the work that we're doing that are a small part of what I hope is a much bigger set of work around focusing measurement on specific claims as opposed to telling big stories without sufficient backing. Some tools that we can build to help us do this better, so using probabilistic models to decouple and understand AI measurements results, and then various ways that we can use these kinds of tools to help with predictability, so understanding intervention effects as we scale and adapt various kinds of models, and how this might have implications for research, governance, policy, and decision making. Okay, with that, I will end. Thank you for your attention this morning.
Hello, my name is Adiza Al-Hassan from Ghana. So my question is, you made mention of when you are training the model in terms of using a synthetic data, and the result is different when it comes to developing another model using synthetic data plus original data. So I want to know, at which point do you use the data in the training? So maybe, is it the training point or is it the test? And also, does it have an effect on which point in time are you training the data? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Very interesting one. So it's a good video too. So the question is around some of what I talked about in model collapse. So in model collapse, we're mostly trying to understand mostly training interventions. So the idea is, I have some data, I train a model, the model synthesizes data, and I'm going to keep doing this, train a model on the synthesized data, I'm going to do this over and over again. This shows up because it's meant to model what's happening in the real world. So the real world, what we're seeing is that people are using, taking data that's collected from, say, ChatGPT and posting it on the web. And that's happening, and then new models are trained on this data that has already been posted on the web. And so this happens over and over again. I want to understand what happens in the long term if this process keeps going over and over many iterations. So that was the framing, that was the question that motivated this. So I'll answer that question, but I think you're also asking questions around what happens, like how do I think about this in the short term if I'm trying to use synthetic data in various ways. But I want to clarify that the model collapse question is really about long-term behavior over many iterations. So here it's mostly in training, what happens in training. And again, the key observation is that using only synthetic data ends up behaving very differently than using synthetic and real data. Mostly what happens is that synthetic data, much more quickly, the behavior anchors to whatever biases the original model had, and it doesn't recover. It takes a lot, it's just hard for the model to recover. Whereas if you use a mix of synthetic and real data, the real data has enough of a regularization effect that the model just drifts much more slowly than what you might predict. And so that was the main goal in the paper that I showed. I think other questions were about how to use synthetic data both in training and in prediction. Super interesting. Beyond the scope of what I talked about today, much longer conversation. I think this is some of what is being worked on both in academia. Many companies are doing synthetic data work. I think it's an interesting direction. Here we just wanted to ask what happens in a model collapse setting. Okay. Thank you for your question.